Hello, and welcome to another episode of Critical Weight Theory. And today I'm dealing with folk tales again. And when we think about folk tales or fairy tales, most of us picture the cleaned up versions with soft edges, clear morals, princesses who suffer quietly until someone saves them. These are the Victorian era revisions many of us grew up with, stories that have been sanded down to feel safe, instructive, and polite. But that's not where these stories began. So today I want to go back before the sanitization, before what people sometimes like to call Disneyfication, back to the older versions of these tales where the feminine is not fragile or passive, but dangerous, sometimes monstrous, and often terrifying in ways that still unsettle us. Think about the witch in the gingerbread house. She isn't just a quirky villain with a sweet tooth, she is hunger itself. She consumes children. She lives alone outside society, self sufficient and deadly. Or the stepmother who doesn't merely resent the younger woman in her care, but actively seeks to destroy her. Or the ghost of the wronged maiden, returning not for justice but for vengeance. So, the concept of a vengeful maiden's ghost is a popular and potent trope in folklore and fiction. These spirits, often appearing as spectral brides, pale women in white, or ethereal figures, share common roots in tales of betrayal, abandonment, and yes, violence. And those are some common motifs and origins. Let's look at the betrayal and abandonment angle to that. So the maiden is typically wronged by a lover, a fiance, or a husband who betrays her trust, resulting in tragic death, often by self extermination or murder. I guess you're not supposed to say a certain word according to YouTube's algorithm. But anyway, this deep sense of injustice fuels the return of the vengeful maiden. And, a quest for vengeance is a part of the story. Unlike standard ghosts seeking a proper burial or resolution, these spirits actively pursue vengeance against their betrayers, their families, or sometimes against men in general. Yep, we're the bad guys once again. And when it comes to these stories, there's something called liminality. They often haunt transitional spaces, bridges where they leapt to their death, crossroads, or the edge of forests, symbolizing their existence between the world of the living and the dead. So, one example of this is the La Llorona, or the Weeping Woman. And I don't know if I did a review of this movie or an interview of somebody who was involved, but I once covered a movie called La Llorona, or it had something to do with that concept. So that's how I became a little bit more familiar with that particular story or legend. So with the La Llorona, while she seeks her drowned children, the origins of many La Llorona stories involve a woman who actually destroys her children after being abandoned by her husband for another woman. She then wanders perpetually, weeping and sometimes exacting a vengeance on other men or children. So, yeah, if one type of person wrongs you, you got to go after everybody of that particular type in the classic formulation. And when you know it, some people out there in the actual world follow that sort of logic. It's a true to life sort of tale in that sense, I suppose. Sometimes people do reflect those sorts of values. If one person in a group wrongs you in some way, then you gotta hold everyone in that group accountable. So there's also the Lady in White, or the White Lady, a widely distributed European and North American legend. There are ghosts who often appear as women in bridal attire who died tragically before their wedding, usually because they were jilted or murdered. They haunt rural roads and bridges, sometimes luring or attacking men. So, yeah, you don't want to be so keen on getting some action that you fall in love with one of these ladies in white and then they just attack you or whatever. You don't want to have that. So yeah, it's an interesting legend. What about Bloody Mary? Now that's one of my favorites. It's a vengeful spirit summoned by saying her name into a mirror. Her origin stories often involve a woman who is murdered by a lover or family member, returning to scratch the summoner's face or seek retribution. So, is it three times that you say her name? I think that's typically how it is. And of course, the horror villain Candyman actually borrows from Bloody Mary as a concept. And boy, I haven't done the Bloody Mary thing in quite a while. So, not that I believe in such a thing, but also you wouldn't want to do the Bloody Mary recitation in front of a mirror alone. I'm not saying that you would need somebody there to protect you or anything like that, but you want it to be sort of a shared experience. Otherwise, I mean, what are you exactly doing it for if it's just for yourself? And then somebody could at least vouch for you and say that you had enough nerve to actually say that into a mirror. So go ahead, go ahead and try saying "bloody mirror" 5 times fast in a mirror and see what happens. It might be a fun little exercise. And I can reasonably assure you that you're probably going to be fine. But it is a fun legend. And maybe one of these days I'll do an entire episode on the myth of Bloody Mary. I don't know. It seems like a fun topic, although I'm not sure how I could expand on it that much. But anyway, there's also the Japanese Onyer, Onryo. So, I probably butchered that pronunciation. The Onryo, the vengeful spirit in Japanese folklore. They're often women who were wronged by lovers or rivals. Are you noticing a pattern here? That's quite often how this unfolds. The the person was just wronged by somebody who's a lover, or in this case, I suppose maybe a rival. But the most famous is perhaps Oiwa. I may be mispronouncing that one as well, from the ghost story Yatsuya Kaiden, who was poisoned and returns to torment her husband. Yeah, those damn husbands, they just suck. They're never any good, are they? Like the Homer Simpson comes to mind, just Homer Simpson or Tim from Home Improvement, or just just dumbasses who kind of deserve ill treatment even if they haven't particularly wronged you in some way. Anyway, they're probably not the best examples of that, but anyway, moving on. These women are not just accidents of storytelling. They're not random villains who are dropped in and they just move the plot along. They're sort of like embodiments of fear. I said embodiments, kind of. It should be embodiments. I mispronounce things, and hopefully some of you are entertained by that, and you don't just see it as a turn off from listening to the episode. I hope my ability to sidetrack actually is a good thing for this show. I don't know, it probably isn't. But specifically, there is a fear of female power, female sexuality, and female autonomy that I think is not just a feminist talking point. I I really should do an episode at some point where I bash feminism, like where I criticize feminism a little bit, because lately I feel like I've been doing too many where I just sheepishly praise feminist theory. But a lot of it is actually correct. I know a lot of right wingers out there don't want to hear that, but plenty of it is correct. So I think I need to actually do an episode at some point where I sort of debunk at least a few feminist claims, just so I could remain, somewhere in the middle, somewhere in the middle, so I'm not too far in the feminist camp. But anyway, in these stories, the feminine becomes a transgressive force, a woman who does not submit, who does not nurture, who does not stay within the boundaries laid out for her. And that kind of woman threatens the entire structure of the world that these stories were told in, and she threatens the patriarchal order itself, so to speak. Now, the story, has to deal with her in some way. So she must be contained, demonized, or destroyed, burned, drowned, pushed into an oven when it comes to the Hansel and Gretel story, cast as a monster so that her power can be explained away as evil rather than acknowledged as real. And this isn't subtle, it's violent and it's intentional. Of course, there are some wicked women who do exist in the world, but I do think that that the feminist theories about these characters, I think they carry some weight. That those theories, I really do. And you know, the uh, the interesting thing is that these tales were often told in communities where women had very little overt power, and their anger, frustration, and rage had few acceptable outlets. And yet, here it is, erupting in story after story. They're not quiet, not polite, but they're feral. By confronting these monstrous feminine figures, the original folk audiences were forced to grapple with something deeply uncomfortable, the reality that suppressed rage does not disappear, it just mutates, it returns, and eventually it demands to be seen. So modern readers feel this too, even if we don't always have the language for it. There's a reason these characters linger in our imaginations, a reason they're endlessly reinterpreted in horror films, novels, and retellings. They are frightening, yes, but they're also compelling. And that's because on some level we recognize the injustice that created these characters. The monster is not born in a vacuum. She is made, and the story's insistence on destroying her says less about her evil and more about what society fears losing control over. And when we revisit these tales today, we're not just indulging in darker versions of childhood stories, we're uncovering a buried history in a way, one where the feminine is not passive, not innocent, and not easily erased. And maybe the real horror isn't that these women were monsters, maybe it's how desperately these stories needed them to be monsters.